Hello and welcome. You're watching Lockdown TV from UnHerd. Throughout this lockdown period, we have been talking to politicians and thinkers and writers and scientists trying to understand the world and understand what sort of place it's going to be when this ends. I'm really excited about the guest we have joining us all the way from San Jose, California today. He is called Matthew B. Crawford, and hopefully you will see him appearing on your screens now. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So just by way of introduction, you are a philosopher or a writer. You were formerly a motorcycle mechanic, and you've written a couple of books, both of which I enjoyed tremendously, and have a new one out called Why We Drive. So I've been a big fan of yours since the first book, since The Case for Working with Your Hands, right through the second one. And I think you've got something really, really important to say, which actually explains better than most of the other analyses I've read, kind of economics-based, why we're in such a peculiar political moment. And some of the, where you talk about life, I think explains very well how we got to a kind of all these populist ructions in the past few years. So really want to get into that. I guess, first of all, to situate us in the present, this latest book was written entirely before the COVID era. Mm-hmm. And since then, everything has sort of changed. How it feels timely, possibly even more timely, thanks to this. How do you read that?
Well, yeah, I mean, with the pandemic, obviously safety, sort of health and safety are uppermost in people's minds, and of course, also health and safety have become a kind of political instrument for kind of managing the population. I think there's a lot of kind of people discerning that. I mean, it's become so obvious. And that gears into one of the major themes of this book, Why We Drive, which is what I call the ideology of safetyism, which, it's, I guess to begin with, it's a moral sensibility. There seems to be a kind of loop wherein the safer we become, the more intolerable any remaining risk appears. And I think that makes us, in some ways, more susceptible or more receptive to kind of projects to make us more safe. And it's sort of under the cover of that, there's various kinds of bureaucratic grasping that take place, whether by corporations or the state.
I mean, what's interesting is that the kind of moral high ground is always with the safetyists. It's always very hard to argue anything other than what will be the most safe option at all times. And what you do quite wonderfully in this book is begin to talk about a different kind of moral high ground, which might not necessarily be the most safe option.
Yeah, so I begin the book with a vignette of riding a motorcycle through the woods, a dirt bike. There are rocks and tree roots and fallen limbs and mud and steep descents and creek crossings, all this stuff just coming at you on the fly. And even if I'm only going, say, 15 miles an hour, it demands total concentration. And if I push it beyond my sort of current skill level, beyond my comfort level, and it goes well, meaning I don't crash, I feel elated. I feel somehow enlarged. But of course, often it doesn't go well. I had one year where I had 4 trips to the emergency room, just breaking a lot of bones. So that raises the question, why? And I think that's sort of the nugget that the book proceeds from, is this hunch that risk is somehow bound up with humanizing possibilities. And that seemed something worth investigating right now, especially because of this big push for driverless cars, which I see as one instance of a wider kind of program wherein the demands of competence give way to a promise of safety and convenience, and often that's proceeds through automation.
So there's something in that kind of moment of you riding that motorcycle. You are at one with this machine, you are at one with your surroundings, you're fully concentrated, and that sort of becomes a metaphor for human flourishing, for life as it should be lived at its best. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. At least there are kind of moments of when you expose yourself to risk that makes you uncomfortable. I mean, it's almost cliche to say so, but these are moments of growth and failure. I mean, I think the two are inseparable, and the determination to eliminate risk from life seems like it's, that always proceeds by pointing to the least competent among us to justify the program, which is a kind of egalitarian principle, which makes perfect sense in many settings. But I think if allowed to kind of colonize everything, every human activity, then there's a kind of infantilization that comes in under the cover of democratic principles. And this book, Why We Drive, is really a meditation on self-government. And my sense is that democracy really remains viable only if we're willing to extend to one another a presumption of individual competence.
So what does the good world look like? I mean, I want to ask you in a minute about what the dystopian world might look like, but what does the kind of Matthew Crawford endorsed best version of democracy look like? Is it a kind of limited government, libertarian sort of world where people are pretty much living untouched by government, or how would you describe it?
To begin with, I don't really have a program. It isn't a manifesto. The second thing, I guess, would be that I think libertarians often have a misplaced their suspicions are sometimes misplaced, because often it's not the government that poses the threat to human freedom. Often it's these sort of quasi-governmental commercial entities. I mean, think about the platform firms of Facebook, Google, et cetera, and just what a far-reaching role they have in our lives. The issue of social trust is in play. And that's an issue that isn't really on the radar of libertarians, who tend to take a very individualistic understanding. And when I look at an urban intersection, especially in a place like Rome, where there doesn't seem to be any rules that are actually being followed, but what you see is this kind of improvisation. People just working it out on the fly. They're cooperating. And to me, that looks like a marvel of social trust. And I think it's a very, small bore, everyday thing. But I think when I see that, I'm looking for clues that can help us sort of guide our hopes for the renewal of social trust more broadly.
So the metaphor extends then. So it starts with driving your own vehicle in harmony with your surroundings as a kind of metaphor for agency in the world and a proper lived life. And then it extends that the road or the intersection can be quite a kind of beautiful example of a harmonious political setup where everyone has agency, but people are respectful of each other's boundaries.
On a good day, yeah. I mean, we're all familiar with when it goes badly. And actually have a chapter on road rage, which is a fascinating phenomena. I think partly it proceeds from just the very basic fact that it's hard to make ourselves understood, what our intentions are from within the car. And it's hard to read other people. You don't know where their attention is directed. You don't know where their gaze is directed. So that can sometimes spiral down into a case of mutually assured misunderstanding. But at the same time, there are these moments of sometimes in London, actually, when I've been there. Since you live there, you probably everyone regards their own driving culture as the worst, I think. But when I go there are times when just the flow is beautiful, where people don't seem to be following rules so much as just kind of um, trying to make it flow. And that's an interesting thing, flow. It's an emergent property of a collective that only happens if everyone is paying attention and brings a disposition of flexibility to it, I think.
I guess what the thing that I find so exciting about this way of thinking is that it offers a substantial counterweight to a kind of entirely economic, entirely kind of mechanistic view of how we should conduct politics there, where basically the only virtue is, better distribution of wealth, preservation of life, alleviation of poverty, all incredibly important things. But there's no sort of other virtue, which is about what a good life looks like, or what flourishing might look like. Governments don't talk in those terms. Politicians don't tend to talk in those terms.
Well, to begin with, your sense of the inadequacy of an economistic account of our common life together, which tends to be sort of begins from an assumption of atomized individuals, and in turn tends to reinforce that as sort of becomes a self-fulfilling picture of society. And I think one of the themes in Why We Drive that cuts the most against that and offers a kind of positive picture of a form of human flourishing that's absent in that picture is the stuff about play. So I have these chapters where I go around to different automotive subcultures and sort of grassroots motorsports just to check it out. And the spirit of play is what sort of I was hit with, and I'm very much was in trying to make sense of this was helped by this Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, who writes about play as the basis of civilization, really. And what he said was that play it's a spirit of hostility and friendship combined. So he found it in sport, he found it in ritualized combat, in competitive dances, in boasting matches and sort of stylized insult trading. So it made me think of the rap battles of like the 90s, So that cuts very much against the spirit of rational control, where you're trying to control everything, because play is about enduring tension and uncertainty and risk. That's the play spirit. And so there's an obvious kind of tension between that and safetyism and rational control.
It sounds kind of a little bit masculine, a little bit macho almost. And in that sense, it sounds kind of retro. This is this sort of spirit of kind of slightly dangerous play and, riding the bike in a potentially dangerous way. How do you respond to the idea that it's sort of more of a masculine view of the good life?
I would fully assent to that characterization of it and be untroubled by it, I think. It's interesting, these days, if you point to something as being masculine, it's taken to be an accusation that should make one start to panic. But that seems unnecessary. And there's a whole tradition of vitalism. So in the U.S., we think of Teddy Roosevelt, William James, the psychologist. He wrote this famous essay called A Moral Equivalent of War. So he was looking for something that would call on the same parts of the soul as war, but not be so bloody. And that's because he regarded hardness and toughness as indispensable to the human spirit. There's a nice automotive expression of that. Did you ever see the movie WALL-E?
Yeah.
Do you remember the scene where there's these grotesquely fat people sort of being ferried about in these pod-like car things, sort of self-driving pods, and they're gazing raptly at their screens, with some sort of piped-in entertainment and slurping from their enormous cup holders. And so their faces beam with this sort of slackened opiate pleasure. So these are people who are completely safe and content, but somehow less than fully human.
Which looks a little bit like a potential future we might be going into if we're all going to be driven around in driverless cars, staring at our Google screens. Is that sort of, I asked earlier what the dystopian possible future is. That's it, is it?
Well, it's interesting. Self-driving cars have played pretty prominent roles in quite a few dystopian movies. I mean, there's Blade Runner, Minority Report, Wall-E. I think you could point to 2 or 3 others. Somehow we have this sense that being rendered into passengers is somehow an elemental form of giving up on agency, I guess, and also a kind of collective agency or sovereignty. So it becomes political very quickly.
The way it becomes political, and this is when I talked about populism in the introduction, we have come through the Brexit controversy in the past few years, and obviously that same year Donald Trump was elected in the States. And both of those, to me, felt like sort of an instance of what you're talking about, which is that somehow the structures of the world, whether they were government structures or they were kind of corporate, multinational structures, had become so big that people didn't feel they had either individual agency or collective sovereignty anymore. And these were kind of cries of anguish against that.
Yeah, so you could point to the yellow vests in France. So this begins as an automotive protest, right? It was sparked by a rise in the fuel tax and a slight reduction in the speed limits, which of course affects people in flyover country, as we call it, more than in the metropole. So, Macron's base in Paris rides the metro and of course also takes environmental virtue as one of its titles to rule. Their interests were very much aligned with these kind of anti-car measures more than people who live out in the periphery. And then in London, I actually have a chapter about this in Why We Drive, as you know, about the fight between the London taxi drivers and Uber, where it's a kind of colonization of London for hire cars by this foreign ride-hailing company that's relying on map software, and the gig economy drivers who aren't invested in the job the way these highly professional London taxi drivers are. So it's a case of some foreign firm practicing a kind of labor arbitrage to basically sidestep local control of what's really a guild, right? This is the taxi drivers are a guild, and according to the free market mindset, this is all to the good, right? Just guilds are bad. It means high prices, and that's a mindset that only treats us as consumers, and sort of the effect on sort of communities of work is completely absent from that picture. But I think that just the obviously kind of colonizing or imperialistic character of this takeover was enough that it was explicit enough that I think it contributed to that Brexit mood. It's like, wait a minute, can we take back control or can't we?
Do you worry about the digital aspect of all of this? That we are literally staring at our screens all day instead of being out there playing or riding our motorcycles, and we're being brought into a kind of weird digital half-life by all of this convenience.
Well, obviously there's there's this economy based on harvesting our attention and then packaging it and selling it, and it does tend to kind of nudge us ever further into a kind of manufactured reality world on screens. And that was the major theme of my second book, The World Beyond Your Head. But when it comes to mobility, we're talking now about the logic of the internet, the economic logic of it, kind of coming out of the screen and into the real world, which I find pretty disturbing. So let me tell you an anecdote. So there was a Google car, self-driving car, a test car that came to an intersection and stopped. And this was a four-way stop. And so it stopped and then waited for the other cars to stop before proceeding through the intersection. But of course, that's not what human beings do. And so the computer didn't know what to do. It kind of got paralyzed there. And the Google engineer, the guy in charge, said that what he had learned from this is that human beings need to be less idiotic. And of course, what he meant by that is that they need to behave more like robots. And that's an inference that comes very easily if you regard the mind as basically an inferior version of a computer. And completely invisible to him was the kind of social intelligence that actually is playing out at that intersection, where people make eye contact, maybe one waves the other through. There's almost a kind of body language of driving. And it works for the most part. I mean, it's a little bit messy. It's not perfectly orderly, but it's functional. But that's invisible to you if you think that reason is basically just rule following like a computer. And so what that points to is the fact that humans and computers are not going to be able to share the road together gracefully. Humans are not going to become more like computers. So the alternative is that they need to get out of the way so that the machines can sort of operate smoothly. So that points to the kind of all colonizing character of it, where driving your own car is likely to become illegal if we go down this road.
Do you feel, talking like this, that there's any chance that things will go in your direction? I mean, it feels like all of the macro trends are going in the opposite direction, and I just wonder how can you win this battle?
Well, it remains interesting just how easily the kind of narrative of inevitability can kind of demoralize any kind of resistance to this sort of incursion. And I think the assertion of it being inevitable is a key part of the kind of business strategy.
It's a sort of get on board or you'll be irrelevant kind of act.
Yeah. What are you clinging to the past? Of course, often people are just clinging to the present as perfectly adequate, like we don't need this. But you mentioned congestion. It's interesting. In New York City, when the city was getting sort of Uberized, this was between 2013 and 17, the number of for-hire vehicles increased by 59%, and the number of unoccupied vehicles by 81%. So, you call your Uber and it comes within like 3 minutes. And the only way that's possible is that the streets are flooded with empty cars. So the New York City transportation manager wrote this article where he's saying this is just massively increased congestion in New York City. And of course, the other part of it is that you're sapping political support for public transportation because those people, who pay substantial taxes, the sort of, managerial bourgeoisie, are now taking the Ubers. They don't want to pay taxes to keep up a crumbling subway system.
Whether it's in politics, talking about people's local agency, or whether it's in these kind of consumer choices where you're trying to fight against these big, apparently inevitable trends, you've got to somehow win that argument. You've got to present something else that's more desirable to people or more good than convenient.
Yeah, well, I guess I would tend to fall back on something very discreditable here, which would be simply the adequacy of the status quo as a principle, as against dreams of a new order that require massive new concentrations of wealth. So again, to take the case of Uber, there was the inevitability assertion, the future has decided this is what we're doing, and sort of the whole press the technology press and business press just got kind of snowed by this. But it's interesting because some serious transportation economics people have started looking into the actual economics of Uber and realized, well, everyone knows they lose billions of dollars every year. They've never made a penny. And what they discovered is that Uber has not discovered new efficiencies that formerly eluded the traffic industry. In fact, they're in some less efficient. So it's interesting. You don't necessarily have to have a picture of an ideal transportation system. You just have to have a little skepticism about the bullshit that gets peddled, and then watch it fall of its own weight and contradictions.
Yeah, I just wonder where this all falls out in politics. And the Brexit example also, it feels like this kind of rage that all of these things are talking about is from those voters are now voting on the right.
Yeah, it's interesting. We now associate populism with the right, and I suppose, it'd be interesting to trace historically how that came to be the case. And I think probably it has to do with sort of the growth of the administrative state being very much sort of bound up with programs of social transformation, right? That is that's the stock and trade of the left, wanting to transform society along, projects of gender and race and sexuality and these things. So if the populist is one who's basically suspicious of sort of rule by experts as a kind of working definition, and the rule of experts has been coinciding very much with sort of transformative social projects, then it makes sense for populism to be a sort of the foot draggers in the march of history would be their characterization.
Certainly here in the UK, there is a little bit of a fusion between kind of old left, the kind of small c conservative old left in a way, with the kind of non-financed led right. And I think in America as well, there's the more religious conservatives that often would understand what you're talking about more than the kind of Wall Street conservative.
Sure. Yeah. And you mentioned old left. Some of my sort of closest intellectual companions have been of the old left, and they are in fact old themselves, old guys who, if your concern is for labor, for the dignity of labor, for its prerogatives, for protecting it as against predations, you will not find that. Before the rise of the new socialism in U.S. politics, it was just absent from progressivism. It was all about social transformation. Now the picture is more complicated. And like you say, there are these kind of new intellectual friendships developing between kind of an old left sensibility and those who might call themselves conservatives, in the sense that they want to preserve a kind of social order in which labor had its place, in which it was in the context of, family life, such that one didn't have to have two incomes to survive, which made possible a kind of moral ecology in the household that was good for children, less divorce. All these things are obviously connected, and we're at this point trying to grope our way toward an understanding of them that will kind of do justice to our condition.
It's almost a holiness when you describe that feeling of feeling alive or having a kind of good and fully existent life, but you'd never talk in religious terms. You grew up in a hippie commune, as I understand it, or some parts of your childhood were in a hippie commune in California, and then you've gone all the way to the Fellow of Philosophy at the University of Virginia. So you can kind of put into words things that are more commonly understood on the right in language that a secular left can understand.
Well, thank you for saying that. That has been, I think, part of what I've wanted to do. And I'm not myself of a sort of religious sensibility, but I've been hugely informed by, like the sort of Catholic social teaching and the whole anthropology that's on offer from sort of Christian philosophy. I mean, I've only dipped into that a tiny bit, but every time I do, I'm like, wow, these people have understood something about the human condition and about human limits and the requirements of sort of a community that is in some way kind of has a horizon to it, is bound, isn't just kind of like a highway rest stop or a Taco Bell. We're just kind of atomized individuals floating through, coming and going.
You've moved back from Virginia to California. You're talking to us from the Bay Area. You're now at the heart of the beast. It's producing all of these huge technologies that are keeping us suppressed. Does it feel like you're now among the people that you left all those years ago and you feel fully comfortable, or do you feel like you now are a sort of alien visitor who needs to destroy the structures you see around you?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I do feel a bit alien just because of the transformation of this place. The whole political economy of the Bay Area is like a city-state. It has very little to do with the political economy of the U.S. in general. I mean, it's anchored by probably $2 or $3 trillion corporations, because there is such a thing now. It's very weird. It's an odd place, and it's infinitely fascinating for a sort of anthropological looking around and trying to figure it out.
You end the book with a question as to whether we need to change the human spirit to work better in a world of bureaucracy and machines, or whether we need to burn that house down. What are you inviting us to do there?
Well, that was sort of the peroration of a rhetorical kind of crescendo. So I'm sarcastically saying, maybe we need to just become more passive and dependent, sort of accept with equanimity the fact that we need to step out of the way so the machines can operate optimally, which isn't obviously is a picture of human degradation. So my answer is no.
What does burning that house down look like, though? It means resisting it somehow.
I think it would mean not simply deferring to the assertion that the future has decided this, the future with a capital F, and it's all inevitable. And I see encouraging signs. People are now have a far more jaundiced take on big tech as a steward of the future and a sort of guardian of our interests. Now, there's a lot of, I think, well-placed suspicion about that. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in our politics over the coming years, because big tech also likes to ally itself with the progressive project. So there's a kind of symbiosis there, which makes some of our political apparatus wanting to remain friendly ties with that whole world. So it's an interesting mix.
Well, there is a lot to be getting on with there, Matt. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you'll be coming to the UK when they lift these bans on travel. And we look forward to welcoming you.
Yeah, I'd love to. And thanks for having me on the show.
That was Matthew B. Crawford, author of Why We Drive, which is coming out in the UK in coming weeks. A lot of interesting and new thoughts there, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. This was Lockdown TV from UnHerd, and we'll be back in a couple of days. Thank you.